There's a particular quality to the way Steven Universe opens every episode. A few seconds of soft watercolor washes, a short ukulele riff, and then Steven himself sprinting down a beach looking delighted for reasons you haven't been told yet. It's a specific feeling, that opening sequence. Warm before anything has actually happened. Slightly silly, in a way that feels intentional rather than accidental. The kind of thing that, if you've seen the show before, probably makes you exhale a bit without noticing you're doing it. That's more or less the spirit we're going for tonight. Or this morning. Whatever time it happens to be when you're listening to this. Steven Universe is an American animated series that premiered on Cartoon Network in November 2013. It was created by Rebecca Sugar, who was at the time the first woman to create a Cartoon Network original series as a solo showrunner, having spent the previous few years writing and doing storyboards on Adventure Time. The show ran for 160 episodes across 5 seasons, then continued with a feature film in 2019, and finished with a 20-episode epilogue series called Steven Universe Future in early 2020. 7 years, start to finish. Quite a lot of ground for a show about a kid who lives at the beach. On the surface, it is a show about a kid who lives at the beach. Steven Universe is 12 years old at the start of the series, half human and half gem, living in a small coastal town with 3 alien beings who serve as his guardians, mentors, and slightly chaotic extended family. His father, Greg, a former rock musician who now runs a car wash called It's Awash, lives nearby in a van. Steven's mother, Rose Quartz, doesn't appear in the show because she gave up her physical form to bring Steven into existence. Her gemstone now lives in Steven's belly button, glowing faintly pink, and is the source of most of his magical abilities. This is all established in the first episode alongside a discontinued novelty ice cream sandwich called the Cookie Cat, which Steven has very strong feelings about. The show is warm. That's not a surface quality. The colors are consistently soft and pastel. The music is easy and ukulele forward in a way that recalls late afternoon rather than morning. Steven himself is one of the most consistently kind protagonists in television. Not naive, not oblivious, just someone who has decided to lead with love as a default position. And the show takes that decision seriously rather than treating it as something he'll eventually have to grow out of. But underneath all of that warmth, there's an enormous amount of history. An intergalactic empire thousands of years old. Characters carrying grief and shame and devotion across millennia. A central mystery that the show spends most of its run slowly, carefully dismantling, piece by piece, until almost nothing we thought we understood in the early seasons turns out to have been the complete picture. Rebecca Sugar has talked in various interviews about how the show grew from a personal place, her own process of working out who she was, what it means to love someone without losing yourself, what we do with the weight of other people's expectations. She's non-binary, came out publicly while the show was still running, and has said that a lot of what Steven Universe is quietly about, including the question of identity and inherited guilt, and the difference between devotion and self-erasure, was something she was working through in the writing at the same time she was working through it in her own life. That's not obvious in the Cookie Cat episode, but it's there, and it becomes less subtle as the show goes on. What makes this work for a video like this, I think, is the pace of Steven Universe. Even when the stakes become very large, the show keeps returning to Beach City, to the ordinary rhythms of a small town by the ocean. Characters eat lunch. Steven plays his ukulele on the porch. The world is big and complicated and sometimes frightening, but it's always possible to come back to something quiet. Tonight we're going to go through all of it slowly. The world, the characters, the history, the secrets, the things that hit differently on a second watch. And alongside the lore, we'll spend some time with what the show is actually doing underneath the surface, because it's doing quite a lot. No hurry. Let's start where the show starts, at the beach. If you'd like to see more videos like this, subscribing means you won't miss any. But let's get into it. Beach City is technically located somewhere on the east coast of the United States. The show implies Delaware at various points, or possibly Maryland, but it feels more like a place that exists slightly outside of ordinary geography. There's a boardwalk, a lighthouse, a small amusement park that seems to always be open but never quite busy. The architecture is a little weather-beaten. The ocean is always present, audible, if not always visible, and carved into the cliff face behind the town is the Crystal Temple, where Stephen and the crystal gems live, which is an enormous magical structure, but which has been there long enough that the locals treat it as a landmark rather than an anomaly. This is actually one of the things the show does that I find quietly interesting, without ever making a fuss about it. Beach City's human residents know that Stephen is something unusual. They know the gems are aliens. There's never been a hiding the secret plot, no moment, where Stephen has to pretend to be normal. The town just accommodates him. Lars and Sadie work at the Big Donut and occasionally get tangled up in whatever's happening that week. Ronaldo runs a conspiracy blog called Keep Beach City Weird and is perpetually close to the truth in ways that are funnier than they are threatening. The Pizza family runs a restaurant. Onion exists and is unsettling in a way the show never fully explains and eventually stops trying to. Just a choice they made, apparently. The show's human cast matters more than it might initially seem. Part of what Steven Universe is doing is making an argument that the ordinary world, the world of boardwalk food and summer jobs and awkward teenage friendships, is worth protecting for its own sake. Not as a backdrop to the magical drama. Steven cares about Beach City the way he cares about the crystal gems, which is to say deeply and specifically, and the show reflects that by giving it texture and permanence. There's something about the show's first season that I think gets undersold a bit. It's often described as the slow season, the one you have to get through to reach the good parts, and I understand why people say that. But I don't entirely agree with it. The early episodes are establishing the texture of the world before they reveal what's underneath it. Every episode where Steven's buying chips at the Big Donut or trying to figure out how to summon his weapon is an episode quietly filling in the geography of a place you're going to spend a long time in. Steven's weapon is a shield. This matters. In a show full of swords and spears and whips, the protagonist's weapon is a defensive object, something you hold up to protect other people. Everything about Steven as a character is built around protection and healing rather than attack. His magical abilities, as they develop through the series, are almost entirely in that register, generating shields, healing injuries, entering other people's dreams, sensing emotions. Even his relationship with conflict is defensive. He almost never wants to fight. He wants to find a third option. The first episode proper, called Gem Glow, establishes the dynamic quickly. The gems are returning from a mission. Steven is trying to summon his shield for the first time. A cookie cat ice cream sandwich is involved. And there's a centipedal monster to deal with. The episode is light and funny and establishes the basic grammar of how the show works without making a big deal about it. But there's a detail in it that the show returns to much later. The centipedal, when it looks at Steven, seems to recognize something. It's a small moment, easy to miss the first time. On a second watch, knowing what you know by the end of the series, it's considerably more. That's the thing about Beach City. The show is always doing this. Leaving things in the early episodes that only make full sense once you understand the history beneath them. The whole world is built on a foundation the audience slowly learns about, alongside Steven, and every now and then the show places something in the frame that rewards people who go back and look. Ronaldo's blog, Keep Beach City Weird, is a good example of this. Ronaldo is a running joke for most of the series. The paranoid local who's always almost right but never quite right, whose theories are just plausible enough to be funny. But he occasionally stumbles into the truth in ways that seem like comedy until you realize he's actually describing the gem mythology with surprising accuracy. And nobody is stopping to correct him because nobody thinks he's genuinely on to something. The Crystal Temple itself is worth describing because it's such a particular design choice. It's a massive stone structure with a carved face on the front, proportions all wrong for a human building. The doorway set into its chest. Inside, there's a small human-scale living room, Steven's space, and then, through a magic door, the gem rooms, which are each a different world reflecting the personality of the gem they belong to. Garnet's room is a vast red space with floating platforms. Pearl's room is empty and white and almost unbearably tidy. Amethyst's room is an enormous pile of everything she's ever collected. Stephen's room is a pocket of pink light above the beach. They're all completely impractical and exactly right for their owners. The visual palette of the show deserves a mention here as well. Rebecca Sugar and the art team made specific choices about how the world looks: soft outlines, watercolor backgrounds, a color palette that tends toward warm pastel with occasional bursts of more saturated color in emotionally significant moments. It's the kind of look that, once you've been watching for a while, communicates mood without needing to say anything directly. Beach City always feels like late afternoon light, even when it's morning, even when things are bad. For a show that eventually asks enormous questions about empire and identity and inherited trauma, it spends a remarkable amount of time just letting you live in this small town by the sea. And I think that's partly what makes the emotional beats land as well as they do. By the time the big revelations arrive, you've spent enough time in Beach City that you care about it as a place, not just a stage. The world is already real before the history arrives to complicate it. The human characters, who get the most development across the series, beyond Greg, are Lars and Sadie, whose relationship across the seasons is one of the show's underappreciated arcs. They start out as co-workers at the Big Donut, with the specific friction of two young people who are both slightly more interested in each other than they're willing to admit. By the later seasons, each of them has found a version of themselves they couldn't have predicted at the start. Sadie forms a band, leaves the Big Donut, discovers that the identity she'd been deferring in favor of work and relationships is actually waiting for her. Lars takes a stranger path involving an unexpected trip to Homeworld, a brief death, and a resurrection that leaves him with pink skin and a space in his hair that functions as a portal. Which is a very Steven Universe arc, really. You go to buy chips at the convenience store and end up fundamentally transformed. And the heart of that world is a boy who plays a ukulele and cares about every single person in it, including the ones who haven't been kind to him yet. Let me start with a specific moment because this one earns its place. The season 1 finale is called Jailbreak. For most of the episode, Stephen is imprisoned on a homeworld ship, separated from the crystal gems, trying to find a way out. He discovers, in a cell on the ship, a small red gem called Ruby, who is desperately searching for her partner. Stephen helps Ruby search the ship. They find a blue gem, more composed, quietly radiant. Her name is Sapphire. And then Ruby and Sapphire embrace, and they fuse, and the being who emerges is Garnet, the crystal gem's leader, their most powerful fighter, the person who has been with Stephen since the very beginning of the series, who has always seemed slightly apart, authoritative, in a way that's been difficult to pin down. Garnet was always a fusion. She's been a fusion this entire time. The show lets that land for a moment, and then Garnet, newly formed, turns to face the villain of the episode and she starts singing. Stronger Than You is one of those songs I find quite difficult to explain to someone who hasn't heard it in context. Rebecca Sugar wrote it in a single night, apparently. It's both a battle declaration and a thesis statement for the entire series. The lyric at its center is, "I am made of love." The idea being that Garnet is stronger than her opponent not because she's more powerful in any technical sense, but because the thing she's made of is real, and what she's fighting against isn't. Ruby and Sapphire choose each other. That choice is what makes Garnet what she is. The show's treatment of fusion is one of its most specific and sustained metaphors. In the gem world, fusion is the act of two or more gems merging into a single, more powerful being. A new person with a shared consciousness, their own name, their own personality, their own set of abilities that aren't quite the sum of what either component could do alone. Fusions can separate back into their component gems and can reform at will, though some fusions choose to stay fused almost all of the time. Homeworld, the Gem Empire, considers cross-gem fusion to be a serious transgression. Gems are expected to fuse only with their own type, and even that only in battle contexts. the idea of two different types of gems fusing out of love, or choosing to stay fused as a permanent relationship, is treated as essentially scandalous. The show is quite clear about what this is a metaphor for, and doesn't feel the need to labor the point. Garnet as a fusion of choice, two people who love each other and have chosen to be together in this total and specific way, is contrasted throughout the series with examples of what fusion looks like when it isn't built on genuine feeling and mutual consent. The clearest counterexample is Malachite. At the end of the same season 1 finale, Lapis Lazuli, a gem we'd met earlier in the series and who had been trapped and damaged and barely recovered from thousands of years of wrongful imprisonment, makes a sudden and startling choice. Jasper, the homeworld soldier who'd been antagonizing the crystal gems throughout the episode, asks Lapis to fuse with her. Lapis agrees. But the resulting fusion, a giant creature called Malachite, isn't a weapon Jasper is controlling. Lapis drags her to the bottom of the ocean and holds them both there, using all of her power over water to keep them trapped together. She tells Steven, later, that she was keeping Jasper down. That was the plan. But they were fused. So she was also keeping herself down. The show returns to Malachite periodically across the next few seasons. And when the fusion finally separates, Lapis' description of the experience is carefully and specifically done. She missed being Malachite, she tells Steven. And Steven, correctly, is unsettled by this. Because that's not what missing someone should feel like. That's something else. It's a description of a trauma bond rendered in the show's specific magical visual language. Two beings locked together, neither entirely willing to let go, the relationship sustained by mutual need and mutual hatred, and something that isn't quite either. We'll come back to Lapis in more detail a bit later. There's also Stevani, which is what you get when Steven and his best friend Connie manage to fuse by accident while dancing. Stevani is a human gem hybrid fusion, the first of their kind, and they're used across a handful of episodes to explore something specific. The most notable is Mindful Education, a careful and precise depiction of what happens when intrusive thoughts take hold during a moment of anxiety. Stevani begins to destabilize because Connie is carrying something unprocessed, guilt about a conflict at school, and the fusion reflects the internal state of its components in real time. The episode's resolution involves a mindfulness technique, demonstrated literally through animation. A children's show that contains a breathing exercise about not being controlled by your own worst thoughts, wrapped inside a story about alien fusion. I don't know. No notes, really. The show uses fusion throughout the series to track the state of relationships in real time, which turns out to be a very efficient narrative device. When Garnet is having trouble staying fused, which happens occasionally when Ruby and Sapphire are in disagreement about something, it reads as a visible, literal argument. When Steven and Amethyst fuse into Smoky Quartz, for the first time, Smoky's personality is bouncy and self-deprecating and a little unsure, which is exactly where both of them are emotionally at that point in the story. When all four crystal gems manage to fuse into Alexandrite, a massive multi-armed being who speaks in all their voices at once, the instability of that fusion tells you something about where the crystal gems are as a unit. It's a reliable shorthand that the show uses with consistency. There's a moment in the earlier seasons where Garnet is asked to explain what being a fusion is like from the inside, and she says something like, "It's knowing that you're two people and choosing over and over to stay together." That's more or less it. Not a permanent state you achieve. A continuous decision. The fusion metaphor works because the show is consistent about the conditions under which it functions. You don't have to be perfect to fuse with someone. Ruby and Sapphire bicker and disagree, and occasionally need to separate and work things out on their own. But the base has to be real. Both people have to be whole on their own, not needing the fusion to feel complete. Choosing it because it's good, not because they can't function without it. That distinction between choosing someone from wholeness and clinging to someone from emptiness is something the show returns to across multiple characters and relationships. Fusion just makes it visible. Garnet's existence is, in this reading, an ongoing argument that the most stable thing in the world is a relationship built on mutual love that is chosen rather than required. The fact that this argument is being made in a children's animated series about alien gemstones is, I think, a rather nice thing. One thing worth sitting with before we move on. The show is very careful about never suggesting that being unable to fuse is a failure. Lapis, for long stretches of the series, doesn't fuse with anyone, and the show treats that as a reasonable response to everything she's been through rather than a deficiency. Fusion is an act of trust, and trust is something you rebuild at your own pace, if at all. The show's world understands this. It doesn't push anyone toward fusion who isn't ready for it. There's also a practical elegance to fusion as a storytelling device that I think is worth appreciating. When you want to show the audience something about the state of a relationship without writing dialogue that explains it, you can just show whether the fusion works. When you want to show that two characters who've been at odds have moved toward each other, you can show them fusing when they previously couldn't. When you want to show a relationship under strain, you can show a usually stable fusion becoming unsteady. It's a tool that the show uses with genuine consistency and intelligence across all 5 seasons, not just in the big emotional episodes but in smaller character moments too. And underneath all of that, the show keeps returning to the same quiet argument, that the choice matters as much as the feeling. Ruby and Sapphire don't need the fusion to function, they want it. There's a difference, and it's the whole of it. There's an episode in Season 2 called Rose's Scabbard, and it's one I keep coming back to. The crystal gems have found a cave hidden behind a waterfall full of Rose's things. Old paintings of battles, the weapons of fallen soldiers, Rose's personal effects, kept here in secret. Stephen is moved by it. The other crystal gems are moved in their own ways. And Pearl is destroyed by it. Not by the cave itself, by the revelation that comes with it. That Rose had this place, this private piece of herself, and Pearl didn't know about it. That there were things Rose kept to herself that she didn't share with Pearl, who had structured her entire existence around the belief that she was Rose's closest confidant, her greatest devotee, the person Rose would never have secrets from. The episode is only 11 minutes long. It does a tremendous amount of work in those 11 minutes. By the end of it, Pearl has run to the edge of a floating platform in a dimension accessed through Lion's Mane and is staring out at nothing. And she says to Stephen quietly, "Sometimes you remind me of her, but you're so different." It's both a statement about how much she loved Rose and a statement about how completely that love has consumed her. Pearl's backstory is one the show reveals slowly and in pieces. On Homeworld, pearls are a servant class. They're created to stand decoratively beside a more important gem, to act as an assistant and a status symbol. They don't have their own purposes. They're defined entirely by whoever they serve. Rose's pearl, our pearl, was apparently unusual from the start. Rose gave her more freedom, more agency, more of a sense of self than pearls were typically permitted. Pearl loved her for it, and that love, which was real, got tangled up with something else. The difficulty of knowing how to be a person when you were made to be an extension of someone else. Even after Rose is gone, Pearl orbits her absence. There's the holographic training Pearl fights when she's processing something she can't say directly. The way she talks about a Rose with a reverence that borders on religion, editing and softening and occasionally actively lying to Stephen about who his mother actually was. The episode Stephen the Sword Fighter, where Pearl is poofed, a gem injury that sends them retreating into their gemstone to regenerate, and the implication that her regeneration takes longer than usual because she's working through something she can't quite face head on. The show doesn't treat this as evidence that Pearl is weak or pathetic. It treats it as a portrait of someone who was never given the tools to have an identity that wasn't derivative of someone else's. Pearl's devotion to Rose was partly a product of her origins as much as it was a choice, and Rose could have done more to help Pearl understand she was more than that. Rose didn't, not entirely. When the full truth about Rose finally comes out, and we'll get there because the reveal is significant, it adds another layer to Pearl's story. Because Pearl was the one person who knew the whole of it. She'd been carrying that secret alone for thousands of years, under direct orders she couldn't disobey. The devotion she felt was real. But the person she devoted herself to was, in some ways, more complicated and more flawed than Pearl's mythology of her could quite accommodate. What's interesting about Pearl's arc across the series is that it doesn't resolve cleanly. She makes genuine progress. There's an episode in Season 5 where she asks someone she's been spending time with to help her find a new reason to live, and it's played with more humor than that description suggests. But there's something real underneath it. Pearl is slowly, incrementally figuring out who she is when she's not primarily someone else's devotee. She goes on dates, she tries things, she builds a relationship with Amethyst that's more honest and less performative than it was in the early seasons. Pearl's relationship with Amethyst is worth spending a moment on, because it's one of the show's more interesting character dynamics. They start out at odds, genuinely, Pearl's precision and perfectionism versus Amethyst's chaos and deliberate messiness. Pearl's grief for Rose versus Amethyst's complicated feelings about her own origins. There's a scene in the early seasons where they spar, and it goes too far in both directions. Both of them saying things they half mean and shouldn't be saying in the way they're saying them. But over time, over seasons rather than episodes, they develop something like real friendship. By Steven Universe Future, they're the crystal gems who are most visibly settled in themselves. Pearl has something like a life. Amethyst has something like contentment. Their progress is visible partly because their starting point was so fractured. Pearl is also, it should be said, coded quite explicitly as a character who was in love with Rose. The show never shies away from this. It's not subtext exactly. It's text that the show respects enough not to make into a dramatic reveal. It's just part of who Pearl is. She loved Rose in a way that was enormous and consuming, and, as it turns out, not reciprocated in the form she needed it to be. And then Rose was gone, and Pearl was left with a love that had nowhere to go. How you keep living after the central organizing relationship of your existence disappears. How you build an identity on the other side of that kind of loss is something the show takes seriously across Pearl's entire arc. The answer it arrives at is something like, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks, and with the help of people who care about you. Which is not a very exciting answer, but it seems to be a true one. There's a song she gets in Season 3 called It's Over, Isn't It? She sings it on a cliff, alone, watching a ship fly away. It's about Rose, about the knowledge that Rose chose something Pearl could never quite follow. The vocal performance is extraordinary. It's one of those moments in the show where the music does something that pages of dialogue couldn't. We'll talk more about the music later. It earns its own section. The show never fully fixes Pearl. She never entirely loses the grief. And the series seems to accept this as a realistic outcome. Some losses don't stop. Some loves leave marks that don't fade cleanly. And Pearl is, among other things, a portrait of what it looks like when love, real and deep and genuine, becomes the thing that prevents you from having a self. That's a specific and recognizable thing. And it's handled with more care than you'd typically expect. Amethyst is the crystal gem who is hardest to describe without making her sound like a type, because she functions that way in the early seasons and it would be easy to mistake the function for the whole thing. She's messy. She eats things she doesn't need to eat just because she wants to. She shapeshifts constantly, sometimes for reasons that make sense and sometimes apparently just because she can. She's loud and physical and cheerful in a way that crowds out the possibility of thinking too hard about anything. Which is, of course, the point. The episode that changes how you understand Amethyst is On the Run in Season 1, when Steven and Amethyst end up at the prime kindergarten. The kindergartens are where gems were made. Not born, but extracted from the earth, grown in holes drilled into the rock, the process of their creation draining the planet of life. The prime kindergarten is a long canyon in the desert, covered in thousands of empty extraction holes. It's a beautiful and slightly horrible image. All those empty pockets in the rock, lined up like some kind of geological record of absence. Amethyst knows where every hole in the kindergarten is, and she knows which one is hers. And when she stands in front of it, she says flatly, "I'm not supposed to exist." What she means is this. The crystal gems fought the gem war to stop the colonization of Earth. They won, in a sense. The diamonds retreated, the kindergartens were abandoned. But the gems that had already been started in the ground kept growing. Amethyst came out of her hole after the war was over, when the crystal gems had moved on, when there was no role for her to step into. She was supposed to be a quartz soldier, large and powerful, built to fight. She came out small, late, and with no assignment. The crystal gems found her and took her in, but the fact of her origins, made to serve a purpose she never fulfilled, in a process that damaged the planet she now lives on, is something she carries around with her constantly. It manifests in specific ways. The chaos and the mess are partly just her personality, but they're also partly a refusal to be contained by anyone's expectations of what she should be. The shape-shifting is interesting. She spends a lot of time in the early seasons shape-shifting into other people, into Pearl, into Greg, briefly into Rose, and there's something in that pattern that's worth noticing. When you're not sure you have a self-worth keeping, you try on other people's shapes. There's an episode called Tiger Millionaire, where Amethyst secretly becomes a wrestling persona, and Steven discovers this and ends up as her tag partner. It's fun, but there is a moment in it where Amethyst explains to Steven why she does it. Being Tiger Millionaire means she can be terrible and exaggerated on purpose, and the crowd cheers for it. She's performing a version of herself that's bad intentionally, rather than being bad by accident. There's a degree of control in that, a degree of safety. Her rivalry with Pearl in the early seasons is also doing something specific. Two people who both feel wrong for different reasons, fighting about it because they can't quite say the real thing. Pearl's problem is that she's too devoted, too orbit-bound, too defined by someone else. Amethyst's problem is almost the mirror image. She can't find a self to be devoted to in the first place. The friction between them makes sense once you understand what's underneath it. The episodes that deal most directly with Amethyst's self-worth tend to involve Jasper, the homeworld quartz soldier who arrives in the season 1 finale. Jasper is everything Amethyst was supposed to be. Large, powerful, built to fight, fulfilling her function completely. The contrast is not lost on Amethyst. There's an arc in season 3 where she challenges Steven to a series of gem battles and keeps losing. And it becomes clear that what she's actually testing is whether she deserves to be where she is, doing what she's doing. She can't win against Jasper physically. Can she win against Steven? And if she can't, what does that mean? The answer the show eventually gives through several seasons of character work is more or less this. The thing Amethyst is measuring herself against isn't real. The quartz soldier she was supposed to be was a product of a colonialist project. The version of her that would have satisfied Homeworld's expectations would have been a weapon for an empire. What she is instead, messy and small and late, and not quite right by any official standard, is her actual self. The one that belongs to her. The show's handling of what it calls defective gems is a thread that runs through the series and reaches its most explicit form in the off-colors. A group of gems hiding in an abandoned homeworld kindergarten who don't conform to their types in various ways. A rhodonite, who is a permanent cross-gem fusion. A Peridot sapphire whose future vision is slightly delayed, so she predicts things that just happened. A pair of Rudel twins who emerged from a single gem hole as two conjoined beings. All of them hidden. All of them aware that they'd be destroyed if discovered. Amethyst's situation is different in degree but similar in kind. A gem who came out wrong by Homeworld's standards, who built a life anyway. The show's argument, implicit but consistent, is that wrong by Homeworld standards isn't actually wrong. It's just different from what the Empire needed. And the Empire's needs aren't a very good measure of a person's worth. There's a thread in Amethyst's arc connected to Greg universe that's worth noting. Maximum Capacity, a season 2 episode, reveals that Amethyst and Greg used to watch terrible television together. In Greg's storage unit to cope with their shared grief over Rose, they'd sit in the dark watching a show called Lil Butler, not talking, just existing alongside each other in the absence, and Amethyst would sometimes gradually shapeshift into Rose's appearance, not to deceive Greg, or not exactly, more like trying to give him something, or trying to understand something, or both at once. The episode is uncomfortable in the specific way that happens when you recognize a coping mechanism in someone else before they can recognize it in themselves. Two people using proximity and distraction to avoid the conversation they actually need to have. Neither of them quite capable of saying the real thing. What makes Amethyst's arc feel earned by the end is that the show never asks her to become something different from what she is. She stays messy. She stays physical and loud and inclined toward chaos. She just stops using those qualities exclusively as deflection. The mess is still there. The difference is that she stopped apologizing for it internally to herself. That's a small distinction and a large one. By Steven Universe. Future, Amethyst has something like peace with this. She's working at Little Homeschool. She's close to the people she loves. The sharp edge of the self-loathing has softened. The show never says she's fixed exactly. It just shows her living more comfortably in herself than she used to. That feels like an honest resolution. Not a cure. A change in atmosphere. The answer is a season 2 episode formatted as a storybook. Garnet tells the story of how she came to exist as a bedtime story for Steven, and the whole episode is drawn in a softer, more stylized way than the rest of the show. Flatter lines, more saturated colors, the look of an illustrated children's book that's been handled enough to be soft at the corners. It's beautiful in the specific way that a really well-made picture book is beautiful, simple, and direct and precise. The story is set 5,750 years ago in Blue Diamond's court. Sapphire, a three-eyed gem with future vision, is brought before Blue Diamond to deliver a prophecy about the crystal gems. She sees the future clearly. 2 rebel gems will appear. There will be a brief confrontation. The crystal gems will be bubbled. Blue Diamond's court will be disrupted but not destroyed. This is the future, and Sapphire can see it with complete clarity. What Sapphire's future vision doesn't account for is a small, clumsy, impulsive red gem called Ruby. Ruby is one of Sapphire's 3 gem guard detail, and when 2 crystal gem rebels do appear and attempt to attack Sapphire, Ruby acts before the future vision says she should. She throws herself across Sapphire's path. The collision causes an accidental fusion, something that wasn't in any of Sapphire's predictions, because Sapphire didn't predict what a variable like Ruby's impulsive kindness would do to the future she thought she could see. The resulting fusion is enormous and wrong-footed, and clearly not something either of them expected. And then it separates, and they're 2 distinct gems standing in the wreckage of a prophecy that no longer matches its outcomes. And Blue Diamond is furious about the cross-gem fusion, and they end up in a forest, separated. Ruby devastated, certain she's caused catastrophe, certain she'll be destroyed for what she did. Sapphire finds her. And then they properly talk, for what seems like the first time, even though they've been in each other's vicinity for however long Sapphire has had a guard. Sapphire tells Ruby that when they fused accidentally, she saw something she'd never seen in any future she'd ever looked at. She saw something she didn't have a word for. Fun is the word they eventually land on, but it's more than that, and they both know it. And then they fuse again, on purpose this time. In a forest, alone, with no audience and no strategic reason and no homeworld approval. They fuse because they want to be together, and the fusion they form is Garnet. That's the origin. That's the answer the title refers to. Ruby's answer to a question Sapphire asks, which is something like, "What are we?" And Ruby, who isn't certain about much but is absolutely certain about this one thing, says, "I think we're both running away together." What Rebecca Sugar has said about Ruby and Sapphire is that she based them on her own relationship with Ian Jones-Quartey, who co-created the show and was her partner at the time. Ruby is impulsive and physical and led by feeling. Sapphire is composed and far-seeing and led by logic. The fusion they form is more than either of them because it contains both of those things in dialogue. The Homeworld ban on cross-gem fusion, and what it clearly represents is one of the show's more transparent metaphors. Homeworld society is built on strict caste lines. Every gem has a type, a function, a designated place in the hierarchy. The horror of cross-gem fusion, from Homeworld's perspective, is partly about power and unpredictability. Fusions are stronger than their components, and the Empire prefers its power structures legible, but it's also about the transgression of categories. Two gems from different castes fusing, choosing each other over their functions, is a statement that the categories aren't the most important thing. The show is quite clear about this without ever belaboring it. Garnet's existence, once you know her origin, is a quiet argument running through the background of every scene she appears in. She doesn't make speeches about it, mostly. She just keeps being Garnet, steady, warm in her specific way, the person the crystal gems turn to. The argument is in the fact of her persistence. Garnet is voiced by Estelle, the British singer, which seems like a surprising choice until you hear it, at which point it seems like the only possible one. There's a quality to Estelle's voice in this role, something warm and authoritative, and very slightly amused. That is exactly right for a character who is, at every moment, a fusion of love choosing to remain. Their relationship is presented throughout the series with a consistency that I find fairly remarkable for a children's program. They're not a symbol, they're a couple. They bicker about small things, they have different processing speeds. When they separate and need to work something out, the show lets that process be messy and real. And when they come back together, it's not because everything is resolved, but because they keep choosing each other. The reunited episode in Season 5 contains their wedding. It was the first same-sex wedding depicted in a major children's animated series. The characters at the wedding are delighted. The gems who've traveled through the show with the crystal gems are there. Beach City's humans are there. Ronaldo is presumably also there, wearing something unusual. The ceremony is interrupted almost immediately by the arrival of Yellow and Blue Diamond, which is a very Steven Universe choice. The moment of joy and the conflict arriving simultaneously, the show not making you wait between them. But the ceremony happens first, and it's warm in the specific way that things are warm when they've been a long time coming. There's something worth sitting with about what Garnet's continued existence actually represents in the logic of the show's world. She is, every single day, evidence that the Homeworld caste system is wrong, not through argument, not through protest, just by continuing to be Garnet, living on Earth, raising Steven, being the Crystal Gems leader, choosing Ruby and Sapphire over and over and over. The revolutionary act isn't in the fusion itself. It's in the persistence, in the refusal to unfuse when the world tells you that you shouldn't exist. There's something quietly inspiring about a character whose entire presence is an act of quiet defiance, and who isn't even thinking about it in those terms. She's just in love, and she keeps choosing it, which the show seems to suggest is sufficient. When Lapis Lazuli first appears in the show, she's a mirror, literally. She's been sealed inside a hand mirror for thousands of years, trapped, stripped of her gem's capacity to function, left in the crystal gem storage with no indication that she was anything more than an inanimate object. Steven finds her, notices something unusual, and talks to her through the surface of the mirror. She communicates back using fragments of video she's collected during her imprisonment. She's been watching from inside the mirror for so long that she has recordings of what feels like everything. The episode in which Steven frees her is called Mirror Gem, and the experience of it is strange in a specific way. You expect the imprisoned magical being to be grateful. Lapis is not exactly grateful. She's disoriented and furious and exhausted, and she needs to go home, and the crystal gems, who she identifies as her captors, are in the way. The situation she escaped from was the crystal gems storage. The people who are trying to help her are also, from her perspective, the people who trapped her. The backstory that emerges across several seasons is this. Lapis was a gem who got caught in the wrong place during the Gem War. She was mistaken for a crystal gem, which she wasn't, and she was imprisoned in the mirror as punishment. She spent thousands of years sealed inside a reflective surface, watching but unable to interact, while the war ended and the crystal gems moved on, and nobody thought to check whether the mirror they'd taken as a trophy might contain a person. When she gets back to Homeworld, things are no better. The Homeworld she remembers doesn't exist anymore. She's questioned, imprisoned briefly, and then sent back to Earth alongside Peridot and Jasper to investigate the Cluster Project. And when Jasper offers to fuse with her as a tactical choice, Lapis agrees. Not because she wants to, because she sees it as the only way to keep Jasper contained. Malachite, the fusion that results, is held together by Lapis wrestling with Jasper constantly at the bottom of the ocean, pouring all her considerable power over water into keeping them both down there. And what she says to Steven later about being Malachite is one of the show's most precise lines about trauma. She kept Jasper trapped, she says. And then, I was terrible. I did terrible things to keep her down there. And when Steven says, but Jasper is terrible, Lapis says, I'm terrible. We both are. That's a true thing about survival tactics that cross into damage. The guilt of the person who had to do something awful to stay alive. The sense that you don't get to be the victim because you also caused harm, even if you caused it in the process of surviving something that was already harming you. And then, and this is the part the show handles very carefully, she confesses that she misses Malachite. Not Jasper specifically, but the experience of being that fused, even with all the cost of it. That's a true thing about certain kinds of damaging relationships. The intensity of them can feel like a kind of intimacy. The missing of them isn't evidence the relationship was good. It's evidence of how complete the entanglement was. After Malachite, Lapis comes to live on Earth with Peridot in a barn. And her life there is fine. Quiet. She makes a melon farm. She and Peridot develop a real friendship, something careful and genuine. But the show never pretends she's healed. She uses apathy as armor. She doesn't want to engage with the larger crystal gem mission. When a new gem arrives on Earth who seems to have been through similar experiences but came out, apparently unbothered, Lapis's response is rage and despair and a sense of profound wrongness about herself. The episode Room for Ruby is quietly devastating, and it ends not with resolution, but with Lapis running away to be alone for a while. Because sometimes that's what someone needs, and the show is honest enough to just let that be the ending. Her relationship with Peridot deserves more than a passing mention, because it's one of the show's warmer developments, once you've spent time with both characters. They're an objectively odd pair. A traumatized, withdrawn gem who's seen centuries of suffering, and a cheerful, precise gem who is only just learning that other beings have interior lives. And yet it works. Lapis grounds Peridot's enthusiasm. Peridot coaxes Lapis into engagement with the world. Peridot introduces Lapis to Camp Pining Hearts, a Canadian soap opera that Peridot has become somewhat intensely invested in. Lapis develops opinions about the characters. They watch it together and argue about who should end up with whom, and it's funny, in the way that two alien beings deeply invested in a terrible human soap opera is always going to be funny. But the humor is earned because of how much weight is sitting underneath it. Two gems processing their very complicated situations by watching a soap opera. There's something quite real about that. Lapis, at various points across the series, reads as someone dealing with depression as much as with the aftermath of what happened to her. The apathy, the tendency to withdraw, the difficulty attaching to hope that things will be different this time. These are specific and recognizable characteristics, and the show is careful not to frame them as flaws to be overcome. They're symptoms of something. They make sense. What the show offers isn't a cure, but something more like a community People who don't go anywhere when Lapis is difficult, who leave space for her to come back in her own time. Her eventual decision to leave Earth when the diamonds seem to be coming, taking the barn with her, is framed by the others as something like abandonment, but from Lapis's perspective, it's a different thing entirely. She's tired. She doesn't want to fight anymore. She's been imprisoned and used and locked in an abusive fusion, and then asked to be a soldier again. And the answer she arrives at is, no, I'm leaving. That's not the heroic choice. The show knows it isn't. But it's Lapis's choice, made from her own damage and her own limits. And the show doesn't punish her for it or quickly walk it back. She does eventually come back, but she comes back on her own terms in her own time. And that feels right. Peridot arrives in the show in Season 2 via remote control. Initially, a voice from a floating robonoid, briefly. And then, in earnest, in marble madness, she turns up in person. Compact, precise, clad in green armor, operating from a position of total certainty about her mission parameters, and a complete lack of interest in anything that falls outside them. She's looking for the cluster, a massive conglomerate of corrupted gem shards buried in the Earth's core that Homeworld planted as a failsafe. Her job is to check its progress. She does not care about the crystal gems. She does not care about Stephen. She refers to them collectively as Earth creatures and finds their interference with her mission both baffling and tedious. She is also almost immediately quite funny, not by design on her part. Peridot's comedy comes from the gap between her absolute confidence in her own logic and the actual situation she's operating in. A gap that keeps widening the more time she spends on Earth. She tries to escape from the crystal gems using her limb enhancers, her extendable arms and feet. They remove the limb enhancers. She is tiny without them. She still behaves as though she's formidable. This contrast is very effective. Her capture and containment by the crystal gems is the beginning of an arc that takes most of 2 seasons. Peridot is, initially, a terrible houseguest. She refuses to cooperate. She attempts to contact Homeworld through any means available. She refers to Amethyst as a defective gem and is surprised when this doesn't land as a neutral observation. She makes a terrible analogy, comparing herself to a dog, which becomes a running joke. But something else is also happening. She starts noticing things. She starts noticing Stephen specifically. This half-human, half-gem being who doesn't fit any category she has a framework for, who responds to her unpleasantness with something she can't categorize. He keeps giving her things and asking nothing specific back. She doesn't have a file for this. The pivotal episode is Message Received in Season 2. Peridot has managed to get hold of a communicator. She's going to contact Yellow Diamond and tell her about the cluster and negotiate something. There's a tense race to the communicator. She gets there first, and then she actually talks to Yellow Diamond. Yellow Diamond dismisses Earth entirely. Tells Peridot the cluster will destroy it, and that's fine. The resource extraction was always secondary to the destruction anyway. Peridot should just leave. Peridot, who has structured her entire identity around serving Homeworld and specifically Yellow Diamond, tries to explain that there are unique life forms on Earth, and that she had been, in the process of investigating the planet, developing something that might have been called an attachment to it. Yellow Diamond is not interested, and Peridot says, very quietly and then very loudly, "You are a clod," and throws the communicator. That's the moment. Not a dramatic speech or a sudden flooding of emotion. Just a small gem who spent her whole life inside a system realizing, in real time, that the system is wrong, and then acting on that realization impulsively before she can talk herself out of it. What follows is her actual integration into the crystal gems, which is rocky. She overcomes her condescension about Amethyst gradually. She and Pearl have a specific tension that takes a while to soften. She learns, very slowly, how to do the thing that is apparently the most basic requirement of the Crystal Gem team, to care about something beyond her assigned mission. What I find interesting about her arc is how unglamorous the actual change looks. It's not a transformation scene. It's not a revelation followed by a new version of the character who sorted everything out. It's a series of small adjustments, of information being incorporated and recategorized, of someone who was made to be certain, slowly learning to be uncertain and finding that uncertainty is survivable. Maybe better than the certainty was. There's a moment in Season 3 where Peridot tells Yellow Diamond's communicator, which she's now keeping apparently as a kind of trophy, that she's a crystal gem now. She says it simply, without drama. It's a sentence that would have been unthinkable a season earlier. The cluster itself, the mission that brought Peridot to Earth in the first place, gets its own resolution, which involves Steven going into the Earth's interior and communicating with it directly. What he finds is that the cluster isn't simply a bomb. It's thousands of gem fragments that have been fused together against their will, unable to form proper gems in constant pain. Steven talks to them. He helps them understand that they can coexist rather than fight. He teaches the cluster to be at peace with itself, contained in a bubble of its own making, somewhere deep in the earth, which is a very Steven solution to what anyone else would have approached as a bomb disposal situation. Peridot, watching this, doesn't yet have the vocabulary to say what she's seeing, but it's the same thing she's been slowly learning all along, that care, applied carefully and specifically, can do things that force cannot. By Steven Universe Future, Peridot is teaching at Little Homeschool and trying, and still sometimes getting it wrong, and still sometimes being surprised that things work out. She hasn't stopped being herself. She's just a version of herself who knows more things. One thing about Peridot's arc that doesn't get mentioned as much as it probably should. The show gives her a genuine sense of humor over time, distinct from the unintentional comedy of her early episodes. In the early seasons, she's funny because she's wrong about things and doesn't know it. By the later seasons, she's funny because she's developed a real personality that has opinions and preferences and strong feelings about campaigning hearts. The shift from accidentally comic to having an actual comic sensibility is one of the subtler character developments in the show, and it's done so gradually you almost don't notice when it happens. Her arc also quietly makes a case for intellectual honesty as a form of growth. Peridot's core characteristic isn't cruelty or selfishness, it's certainty. She's wrong in the way that very smart people who've been inside one system of thought for their entire lives are wrong, completely, and without any awareness that there's information outside their framework. What changes isn't her intelligence or her precision, it's her willingness to update when the information she encounters doesn't fit the model. That's a specific and valuable kind of change, and the show presents it as something achievable through small accumulations rather than single revelations. The first 3 seasons of Steven Universe build Rose Quartz into something close to a myth. She appears only in photographs and recordings, in the memories of people who loved her. In those materials, she's radiant and enormous and certain. A leader who started a war to protect life on Earth, who loved the planet and its people, with a completeness that nobody who knew her could quite get past. Pearl speaks of her in hushed tones. Greg talks about her with a kind of rueful wonder. The crystal gems named their rebellion after her. Steven grew up in her shadow in the most literal possible sense. He carries her gemstone. He inherited her powers, and everyone around him has been, in various degrees, working out how to relate to him as a continuation of her. There are cracks early on, if you know to look for them. Bismuth's reaction when she's freed in Season 3 tells you something is wrong. She's joyful and then suddenly not, and the show doesn't immediately explain why. The details of the gem war don't quite add up. Lion, Steven's pink lion companion who holds secrets in his mane, knows things about Rose that nobody thought to catalog. In Storm in the Room, Steven confronts a holographic version of his mother, in a pocket dimension, and the confrontation is quiet and devastating. He can't be angry at her, because she isn't there, and he can't understand her because she never explained herself. The truth comes out in Season 5, in an episode called A Single Pale Rose, and it reframes nearly everything that came before it. Rose Quartz and Pink Diamond were the same person. Pink Diamond was one of the 4 rulers of the Gem Empire. She was given Earth as her first colony, sent to build a kindergarten, and begin the extraction process. She arrived on Earth and began to love it. The life on it the humans, the organic chaos of a living planet. She asked Yellow Diamond and Blue Diamond to let her keep it. They said no. She asked again. They said no again. She tried running away, exploring the planet disguised as a common Rose Quartz gem. That didn't change anything either. And so, eventually Rose Quartz, who was Pink Diamond, staged her own assassination, with Pearl's help. Using Pearl's ability to shapeshift, Pink Diamond appeared to be shattered by Rose Quartz in public. The crystal gems believed it. The diamonds believed it. Pink Diamond fled into her Rose Quartz identity and never went back. The gem war continued, not to stop colonization, but because the diamonds, maddened with grief, decided to destroy Earth along with the crystal gems who'd apparently killed their diamond. The corruption event at the war's end, a blast from the diamond's combined power that turned nearly every gem on Earth into a mindless, suffering creature, was an act of grief and revenge, and it came partly from a decision Pink Diamond made, from a grief she inflicted on people who loved her. The reveal reframes almost everything. It reframes Pearl's devotion, which now has another layer of secret inside it. She kept this for thousands of years, by direct command because Pink Diamond told her to, in a way she literally could not disobey. It reframes the crystal gems' relationship to their own rebellion, which was in some structural sense started by the person doing the colonizing in the first place. It reframes Greg's memories of Rose and Bismuth's buried rage and the whole question of what it means to love someone whose full self you didn't actually know. The episode A Single Pale Rose delivers the revelation through Pearl's memories, which Steven has to navigate through Connie's mother's phone. Pearl couldn't tell him directly, she was under a direct command not to, an order from Pink Diamond that overrode her ability to say the words. So she shows him instead, through the specific sensory experience of having been there. It's an unusual narrative device, and it makes the reveal feel more intimate and more disturbing than a simple confession would have. Steven's process with all of this is not quick. There's anger and grief, and the strange experience of learning that your mother's flaw wasn't that she was ordinary, but that she was enormous in her wrongness as well as her rightness. He goes through a period of identifying with Pink Diamond in ways that are uncomfortable for him. There's an episode in future where this surfaces again. The old wound, the sense that he inherited not just her powers but her patterns. What the show eventually arrives at, quietly, is something like, you can love someone and be furious at them and mourn the version of them you thought you knew, all at the same time. You can find that the person who loved you was also a person who caused great harm. Those things don't cancel each other out. They exist together, and you have to find a way to hold them both. There's also the question of who Pink Diamond was before she became Rose Quartz. The show sketches her in somewhat. Impulsive, curious, younger than the other diamonds in some meaningful way. Someone who'd been given something enormous and didn't want it in the form it came in. She's not unsympathetic. But the choices she made after deciding to abandon her diamond identity weren't fully honest, and she knew it, and she made them anyway. Rose's decision to bubble Bismuth rather than disagree with her openly, leaving her hidden in Lion's Mane for thousands of years without telling the other crystal gems what happened, is one of the clearest examples in the series of how Rose's pattern of evasion had real costs for real people. And there's Spinel, who we'll get to, standing alone in a garden for 6,000 years, waiting for a return that was never going to come, because Rose didn't go back and end the game she'd started. The show doesn't make Rose a villain, it makes her a person who made enormous and consequential choices, driven by genuine love and genuine desire to escape the prison of her own identity. With a catastrophic failure to account for what the consequences would be for everyone around her. She loved Earth. She also left behind a great deal of wreckage. Those two things are both her, and the show asks you to hold them together. The Diamond Authority is 4 beings, white, yellow, blue, and pink, who collectively govern the Gem Empire. Or did. By the time we understand what the Gem Empire actually was, it's already in the process of being dismantled. The gems are colonists. That's the project at the center of the show's mythology. The gem empire finds planets, drains them of resources to create new gems, and moves on, leaving dead worlds behind. Earth was supposed to be one of those planets, the Crystal Gems Rebellion, whatever its complicated origins, was ultimately an attempt to stop that from happening to one specific planet. They succeeded, at considerable cost, and Earth survived. Yellow Diamond, when we finally see her properly, is striking. She's enormous. Entirely rational in her presentation. Cold logic, no sentiment, everything justified in terms of efficiency and resource management. She shuts down Blue Diamond's grief about pink with a song, an actual song, called What's the Use of Feeling, Blue, which is one of the stranger musical moments in the show. She's telling Blue Diamond to stop feeling sad because it isn't useful. This is clearly not how feelings work. This is also clearly how Yellow Diamond functions, by suppressing everything that doesn't serve the mission. But the cracks in Yellow Diamond are visible, once you know to look. She's grieving too. She's just decided that grief is inadmissible, that the correct response to loss is to eliminate the source of the reminder and keep working. Her aggression toward Earth isn't only strategic, it's personal. Earth is where Pink Diamond was lost. Destroying it would remove a constant source of pain. Blue Diamond operates from the opposite direction. She's all grief all the time. She preserved part of Earth's ecosystem in a human zoo as a memorial to Pink. Her weapon is empathic sorrow. Proximity to her makes everyone around her feel what she's feeling, which is an overwhelming and undifferentiated sadness. She can't move past the loss. She won't. She's built a life around the commemoration of it. Yellow suppresses. Blue drowns. These two together form a kind of model for the two non-functional responses to grief. And then there's White Diamond. White Diamond is the oldest, the most powerful, the one who sets the standard for everything in the Empire. She's rarely seen in the series. Her palace is at the top of Homeworld, above everything else, and the other diamonds don't go there casually. When Steven finally meets her, she's been essentially isolated for an unclear amount of time, managing the Empire remotely, perfect in her own estimation. Her particular belief is that there's a correct version of every gem, and that deviation from that correct version is simply malfunction to be fixed. Not addressed, not understood, fixed. She tries to do this to Steven near the end of the series, extracting his gem to make him into Pink Diamond again, as though Steven is just a malformed Pink Diamond and not his own person. The resolution of the Diamond Authority arc in Change Your Mind is worth describing because it's unusual. Steven doesn't defeat White Diamond. He doesn't out-argue her. He talks to her and cries in front of her and shows her the whole of himself, including the parts that aren't Pink Diamond and the parts that aren't clean or resolute or strategically useful. And she starts to crack. Not because he's stronger, but because she hasn't been truly seen. Not seen without an agenda. In an unclear amount of time. The experience of being looked at honestly by someone who isn't afraid of her and doesn't want anything from her is apparently something she doesn't have a defense against. It's a quiet climax for what's been built as an enormous threat. But it's the right one for the show. Steven's whole power set is about connection and empathy. His weapon is a shield. The final confrontation with the most powerful being in the universe resolves through genuine human feeling. The Homeworld caste system deserves a moment as well, because it's one of the more carefully constructed aspects of the show's world building. Every gem has a type, and within that type, a function. Deviation from that function is, at minimum, a problem. Being too different from your type can mean being destroyed. The off-colors, the gems Steven encounters in an abandoned Homeworld kindergarten, are hiding because they don't fit their categories. A rhodonite, who is a permanent cross-gem fusion. A Padparadscha sapphire, whose future vision is slightly delayed, so she predicts things that just happened. The Rudel twins who emerged from a single gem as two conjoined beings. All of them surviving by not being found. The human zoo is worth a brief mention. Blue Diamond preserved a section of Earth's ecosystem in a space station orbiting the planet. a habitat containing humans who've been kept in careful, comfortable captivity for thousands of years, tended by gems, completely unaware of the world outside. The humans in the zoo are happy. They're fed, they're safe, they have everything they need. They've also never had a choice about any of it. The show presents this not as a villain's lair, but as a well-intentioned cruelty. The act of someone who thought she was protecting something, but was actually just containing it. Defining love as preservation rather than freedom. What the Diamond Authority arc is doing, at the largest scale, is showing what happens when you build a civilization on the principle that there's a correct version of every being, and the purpose of power is to enforce that correctness. You get hidden defectives, you get corrupted gems, you get 3 rulers of an empire who are so armored against their own feelings that they can't comfort each other when something terrible happens. And then you get Stephen, who is none of those things, walking into the middle of it. There's something the arc does with systemic harm that I find more honest than most fiction manages. It shows that the diamonds are themselves suffering inside the system they've built. Yellow Diamond is suppressing her grief until it comes out sideways as aggression. Blue Diamond is drowning in hers. White Diamond has isolated herself inside a perfection so absolute that she's become, in some way, unreachable. They're not happy. The Empire isn't making them happy. And yet they can't imagine any other way, because the system is so total that questioning it would require questioning everything they are. That's a recognizable thing. At a human scale, systems that harm the people inside them aren't always maintained by people who are thriving. Sometimes they're maintained by people who are suffering inside them but can't see outside them. The Diamond's grief is real. The harm they caused is real. The show holds both of those things without resolving them into a simple moral, and I think that's part of why it resonates with people who have spent time thinking about how institutions actually work. The Gem War's real legacy in this reading isn't the victory of the crystal gems, but the existence of Stephen, a being who was made possible by the war and its aftermath, who doesn't fit any of the categories the war was fought over, and who is therefore able to see across them in a way nobody else can. That's the show's quiet argument about what makes change possible. Not power, not even righteousness. Something new that doesn't belong to either side. There's a specific kind of episode in Steven Universe that I'd call the difficult honesty episode. An episode where the show introduces someone sympathetic, with entirely valid reasons for being the way they are, and then asks you to hold 2 things at once. That their anger is justified, and that their proposed solution is still wrong. Bismuth's episode, also called Bismuth, in Season 3, is the clearest example of this. Bismuth is introduced emerging from a bubble inside Lion's Mane, a pocket dimension accessed through the lion that used to belong to Rose, full of objects from the war that Stephen hadn't discovered yet. She comes out disoriented, then joyful, then enormous in her warmth. She's large, muscular, with a rainbow shifting coloration that shifts as she moves. A blacksmith, a builder, the crystal gem who made the weapons and tools for the rebellion. The crystal gems who knew her, Garnet, Pearl, Amethyst, are overjoyed to see her. There's a sequence where they crowd back together and everything is bright and loud and good, the kind of reunion that makes the show's world feel like it has real history behind it. And then she and Stephen spend time together. And she shows him her forge, and she describes the rebellion with a fire and specificity that makes it feel real in a way the show's backstory often doesn't. She was there. She made things that mattered. She fought for something she believed in, and then she shows him the breaking point. The breaking point is a weapon Bismuth designed that can shatter gems, not poof them and send them retreating into their gemstones temporarily, but shatter them permanently, destroy them. She designed it for use against the diamonds, against the homeworld commanders who were shattering crystal gems. An eye for an eye. Rose refused to use it. Rose bubbled Bismuth and hid her in Lion's Mane without telling the other crystal gems. The rebellion went on without her. When Bismuth describes this to Stephen, her anger is completely coherent. The diamonds were shattering gems. The crystal gems were dying. Rose refused a weapon that would have ended the war, and the war continued and more gems died. The logic holds. The injustice of it is real. Stephen says no anyway. He says no clearly, and his reasoning is that if the crystal gems started shattering gems, there would be no meaningful difference between them and what they were fighting against. That the means become the ends. That you can't build something new on that particular foundation. And Bismuth, who has waited thousands of years in a bubble while the war continued without her, who has all of this rage that has been coiled inside her for that entire time, attacks him. It's a difficult fight to watch, partly because neither of them is wrong in all the ways they're fighting about. Stephen is right that the breaking point is wrong. Bismuth is right that something serious was asked of the crystal gems that wasn't adequately acknowledged. Rose was wrong to bubble her without explanation, without letting the other crystal gems know what happened. All of these things are simultaneously true. The show does something important here. It doesn't make Bismuth a villain. It doesn't redeem her quickly either. Stephen poofs her and rebubbles her and tells the crystal gems what happened. And the episode ends with an enormous, unresolved weight. The joy of her return and the grief of what she reveals about Rose and the specific sorrow of Bismuth herself, who just wanted to do something definitive about the harm being done, all sitting together, uncomfortable, unresolved. She comes back in Steven Universe future, working in little homeschool, quieter, still herself, still warm, still carrying the history. She and Stephen have found a way to be around each other that acknowledges what happened. It's not resolved, exactly, it's tolerable, which is sometimes the best outcome available. And there's something I think the show is doing very deliberately with where it places Bismuth in the overall story, which is that she appears shortly after the show has fully established Rose as a complex and flawed person. By the time you meet Bismuth, you already have doubts about Rose. Bismuth confirms them in the most uncomfortable possible way, not by making Rose simply villainous, but by showing a specific person who was genuinely harmed by a specific choice Rose made, while also being genuinely wrong about what to do with that harm. The show uses her to ask a question it doesn't answer. What do you owe someone whose cause you believe in but whose methods you can't accept? And what do you do when you're the one who drew the line and the person on the other side of it has reasons? Bismuth as a character is fun to spend time with, even apart from the thematic weight of her arc. She's enthusiastic about her work in a way that's infectious. She makes Stephen a new weapon early in the episode, customized to his style, because that's what she does. She sees a person and she thinks about what would help them, and then she makes it. There's a care in her that's visible regardless of everything else going on. What I find valuable about her arc is that it refuses a simple moral. The show doesn't say the crystal gems were entirely in the right. It doesn't say Bismuth was entirely in the right. It says that there was a situation that didn't have a clean answer, and that the people in it made imperfect choices under impossible pressure, and that those choices have lasting consequences. And here we all are. That's a more honest treatment of questions about justice and tactics than you tend to get in most stories. The tendency is to either validate the ends, justify the means position, or to clearly condemn it, and then move on. Steven Universe sits with the difficulty instead. There's a scene in Season 5 where Stephen, having been captured and brought to Homeworld to stand trial for the crimes of Rose Quartz, announces to a courtroom full of Homeworld gems that he is Rose Quartz. He says it carefully as though he's been thinking about it for a long time. He says it as though it's a decision he's made. He is Rose Quartz. He accepts the consequences. He's wrong. He's not Rose Quartz. He's Steven Universe. But he's been living inside the weight of her identity for his entire life. And at this particular moment, the weight has convinced him that the correct response to all of the harm she caused is to become her and accept her punishment and let that be enough. This is one of the show's most precise observations about what guilt can do to a person. Stephen didn't cause the gem war. He didn't trap Bismuth in a bubble. He didn't fake Pink Diamond's death or stage a rebellion that ended in thousands of gems being corrupted. He was born after all of that happened. He didn't choose any of it. And yet, by mid-season 4, he's walking into a Homeworld courtroom and saying, I did this. I am her. It's me. The mechanism of this is interesting to trace through the series. Steven grows up understanding that he carries his mother's gem, that he inherited her powers, that the crystal gems knew her and loved her, and that their love for him is at least partly refracted through their love for her. He looks like her in some ways. Her gem is in his body. When she comes up in conversation, the room changes. Early on, this is mostly fine. He doesn't have full access to Rose's history, so the weight of it is more of a warm myth than a burden. But as he learns more about the war, about the corrupted gems, about Bismuth, about the diamond's grief, about the fact that Rose Quartz and Pink Diamond were the same person, the weight accumulates, and at some point it crosses a threshold. The title of the season 4 finale is I Am My Mom. Steven surrenders himself to 2 homeworld gems, Aquamarine and Topaz, to prevent his friends from being taken. He turns himself in by announcing that he's the one they want, that he's Rose Quartz, Steven's mother, the gem who shattered Pink Diamond. He makes himself responsible for everything because the weight has become unbearable, and this seems like the only way to put it down. The homeworld arc that follows is partly about Steven navigating the consequences of that decision, but it's also about the show clarifying for itself and for its audience that Steven is a separate person. He didn't commit those acts, he carries the gem, but the gem doesn't make him her. He was shaped by her legacy without being an extension of it. The homeworld trial has an interesting detail. A defense zircon, a gem lawyer assigned to argue for Steven's innocence, starts pointing out actual inconsistencies in the official narrative of Pink Diamond's shattering. How did Rose Quartz, a relatively low-status gem by homeworld standards, get close enough to Pink Diamond to shatter her? Where were Pink Diamond's pearl, her escorts, her guard? The case, when you look at it carefully, doesn't make sense. The trial is interrupted before it concludes, but the seeds are planted. The climax of Change Your Mind is built on Steven's specific identity. When White Diamond extracts his gem to try to make him into Pink Diamond again, the gem, separated from Steven's human half, produces a pink, slightly wrong version of Pink Diamond rather than Steven. And Steven himself, the human half, fights his way back to his own gem and refuses the extraction. He tells White Diamond his name, not Pink Diamond's name, not Rose Quartz's name, his own name. That's the whole of it, really. The whole 5-season arc. A boy who was born inside an enormous myth, who spent his childhood slowly discovering the myth's cracks and failures, who eventually arrived at the knowledge that he doesn't have to be the myth. He can be himself. He can acknowledge the inheritance without being owned by it. The show makes this look like a climax. It is. But Steven Universe Future then picks up 2 years later and asks what happens after that climax, which turns out to be a considerably more complicated question than the climax itself suggested. There's something the series does throughout its run, not just in the big identity episodes, that I find worth noting. The small moments where Steven's conflation with Rose surfaces in everyday interactions. Characters addressing something to Rose that lands on Steven. Gems who approach him with a reverence that doesn't quite fit the person standing in front of them. The moment in the trial where a Zircon argues that Rose couldn't have done what she's accused of, which should be exculpatory, but which means nobody in the room is actually seeing Steven, they're still arguing about his mother. He is, in a strange and specific way, more invisible in these moments than he would be if they weren't interested in him at all. Being absorbed into someone else's mythology is its own kind of disappearing. Future is honest about this in a way the main series, with its larger stakes, doesn't always have room to be. When the war is over and Steven doesn't have a mission anymore, what's left is the question of who he is without one. And the answer takes the whole of the epilogue series to start arriving at, which seems about right. Rebecca Sugar wrote or co-wrote the majority of the show's original songs. There are over 100 of them, spread across the series, ranging from 30-second throwaway ditties to full production numbers that carry the emotional weight of entire character arcs. The show uses music differently from most animated series. It doesn't use songs to underscore or illustrate. It uses songs to do things that dialogue simply cannot. The ukulele is worth mentioning here as the show's central instrument, because it's a deliberate choice. Steven plays ukulele. The show's incidental music draws from ukulele-led composition. It's a soft, informal instrument, the kind of thing you play on a porch in the evening, the kind of sound that suggests leisure and warmth rather than drama or ambition. It's the opposite of what you'd score an intergalactic war to. And yet the show makes it work, because the whole argument of Steven Universe is that the intimate scale is the one that matters. The universe is enormous. What happens between specific people, in specific moments, in specific relationships is what the show cares about. Stronger Than You is the song most people know first, and with good reason. Garnet sings it in the Season 1 finale while fighting Jasper. And it's both a battle declaration and the show's thesis statement in song form. Sugar has said she wrote it in one night. The central lyric, I am made of love, is simple enough to be on a poster and specific enough to mean something. The song is also technically impressive in the way it uses Estelle's natural register, which is warm and assured without pushing into performance. It sounds like a person talking. At slightly elevated tempo and pitch, that's harder to do than it sounds. It's Over, Isn't It Is Pearl's song from Season 3. She sings it on a cliff at night, watching a ship fly away. And it's about Rose, about the knowledge that Rose chose something Pearl couldn't follow. The vocal performance by Dee Dee Magno-Hall contains a note, right at the peak of the song, that I find difficult to describe except to say it sounds like something actually breaking. It's one of the more extraordinary vocal moments in any animated television, and it's in an 11-minute episode on a children's network, which seems about right for this show. Here Comes a Thought is a Season 4 song performed by Stevani, and it's one of the more practically useful pieces of music I've come across. It's about intrusive thoughts, the process of noticing a thought that's troubling you, acknowledging that it's there rather than fighting it, and allowing it to pass rather than letting it take over. The animation syncs the lyric to a visual representation of this process. It was written with genuine intention around anxiety. A lot of people encountered it as children and only understood what it was actually doing years later. A lot of people encounter it as adults and find that it works. What's the Use of Feeling, Blue, Yellow Diamond's song, is one of the stranger entries in the show's catalog. A cold, logical argument against grief, sung in a voice that is itself suppressing grief. Performed in a formal and slightly eerie production style, it's effective as a character piece and as a piece of music in its own right. Yellow Diamond is voiced by Patti LuPone, which is a fact that sounds like it shouldn't work and absolutely does. Other Friends, Spinel's villain introduction from the film, became immediately recognizable the way that certain perfect marriages of character and presentation do. The character design combined with a song that sounds like a 1920s cartoon character who is extremely angry is one of those creative choices where you watch it and wonder why nobody had done it exactly this way before. And then there's True Kinda Love, Ruby and Sapphire's wedding song from Season 5, which is gentle and specific in the way that good love songs are. It's not about love in the abstract, but about this particular love between these two particular people who are funny and mismatched and completely committed to each other. One thing the show does that I find technically interesting is use songs at moments of emotional impasse. Moments where a character has reached a feeling they can't express through normal conversation. Do It For Her / Him is Pearl teaching Connie to sword fight. And the song moves from something inspiring into something troubling as you realize Pearl's advice is being shaped by her own damaged relationship with sacrifice. The song sounds motivational. What it's actually saying is more complicated. That doubling is a fairly sophisticated trick. Escapism, sung by Steven during a low moment in Season 5, is a short, quiet, very beautiful song about wanting to leave your own life for a little while. It sounds like a folk song. It sounds like it's been around for a long time. The simplicity is what does it. The music also works as a structural marker. Most of the time, the show's incidental score underlines mood without calling attention to itself. When a character breaks into a full song, it signals that something is being said in a register that's unavailable to dialogue. The audience learns this rhythm and responds to it accordingly. A song in Steven Universe means, pay attention to this. Whatever is being said here couldn't be said any other way. Connie Mahaswaran is introduced in Season 1 as the kind of character who is immediately likable and easy to underestimate. She's bookish, earnest, slightly awkward. The kind of kid who reads fantasy novels and takes careful notes and arrives to beach parties wearing a sun hat and sunscreen factor 50 because her mother told her to. She's been lonely in a specific way. Her family moves a lot due to her father's security work, and she hasn't figured out how to make friends quickly enough to keep them before the next move. She and Steven become friends almost immediately in the effortless way that sometimes happens between people who are exactly the right kind of weird for each other. She finds him strange and the crystal gem stranger, and is delighted by all of it in a way that reads as real rather than performed. There's an episode early in Season 1 where Steven accidentally heals her eyesight while she's wearing her glasses, and she has to figure out how to tell her mother that she no longer needs them without explaining how it happened. The difficulty of navigating her parents' expectations while also keeping Steven's world private is a small, completely relatable thread that runs through her early appearances. Her mother, Dr. Priyanka Mahaswaran, is one of the show's most carefully drawn parent figures, specifically one of the most honest portrayals of overprotective parenting in animation. She loves Connie absolutely and completely, and in service of that love she has made choices, having Connie's eyes corrected without properly explaining the procedure, structuring Connie's entire schedule around achievement and safety, treating the world primarily as a threat to be managed, that have produced a daughter who is excellent on paper and somewhat uncertain about who she is when nobody's measuring her. Dr. Mahaswaran is not a villain. She's a parent who is expressing love through control, which is a pattern the show takes seriously as a problem without treating the parent as irredeemable. The nuance there is worth noting. The show doesn't punish her for it or write her off. It just shows her the consequence and lets her choose differently. Nightmare Hospital is the episode where this gets addressed directly. Connie's mother discovers the crystal gems and the magic, and there's a confrontation. What Dr. Mahaswaran ends up saying at the end of it is specific. She realizes she's been treating Connie as something to be protected rather than as a person to be known. Her apology is not vague. It's a mother saying to her daughter, I want to know who you are, not just keep you safe. Connie's training with Pearl, which comes from Connie's own desire rather than anyone else's suggestion, is about more than swordsmanship. It's Connie building a self that's hers, a competence that doesn't come from her parents' ambitions or Steven's world, but from her own choice to develop it. By the middle seasons, she's a skilled fighter who also happens to have strong opinions about the structure of fantasy novels. These two things coexist without one overwhelming the other. Stevani, the fusion she and Steven form when they dance, is the show's way of being specific about what their relationship actually is. They're equals. The fusion is stable not because one of them is stronger or because they merge when one needs the other's support, but because they're two whole people who want to be together. Stevani has their own voice, their own face, their own confidence. When Stevani has difficulty, when anxiety takes over in mindful education, it's both of them carrying something, not one carrying the other. Stevani is also, worth noting in passing, a non-binary character in a major children's series using they/them pronouns, introduced without fanfare and treated by the characters around them as entirely normal. The show's approach to all of its representation is worth noting in this context. It doesn't announce these things. It just makes them part of the world. These facts are unremarkable within the show's world, and the show treats them as unremarkable. That choice is itself a form of argument, that these things are normal, that they've always been normal, and that the interesting stories are about the lives they're part of, not about the fact of them. By Steven Universe Future, Connie is applying to university. She has her own life, her own trajectory, her own friendships and interests that don't depend on Steven. In one of the later episodes, she gently tells Steven that she's building a life and that she needs him to be alright with that. Not leaving, just growing. It's framed as a kind thing, said with care. And it is a kind thing. But it also makes clear that Connie never let herself become simply Steven's supporting character. even when that might have been the easier choice. What I find interesting about Connie's arc is that the show gives her the same interiority it gives the crystal gems. She has bad days, she has guilt she doesn't process well, which is what surfaces in Mindful Education. She has a competitive streak she's aware of and isn't entirely sure what to do with. She gets storylines that are entirely about her relationship with her own life, rather than about Steven. These are all choices the show didn't have to make. It made them anyway, because it cared about every character having a real interior life, not just the ones with gemstones. Her friendship with the crystal gems is quietly important. Pearl, who trains her, develops a genuine respect for Connie's work ethic and precision. Connie responds to Pearl's confidence in her with a gratitude that has real content. There's a warmth between them that isn't routed through Steven. In a show that's partly about the danger of organizing your entire identity around someone else, Connie's arc is proof that you can love someone deeply while also being undeniably yourself. That love and selfhood aren't in competition, that the two of them existing clearly and separately is what makes the fusion they form possible at all. The movie starts with a song. It's an upbeat, musical theater style number, and Steven is in it singing about how everything is fine and the war is over and the crystal gems have done what they set out to do. He's 2 years older than the end of the series. He's happy. He sends a broadcast to the universe, a general announcement full of warmth, telling all gems that the Earth is a safe place now, that they're welcome here. That's when Spinel arrives. The character design is immediately striking. She's pink, large-eyed, with a rubber hose aesthetic that looks like a 1920s cartoon character. The kind of character design you'd see in early Fleischer Studios animation, before animated characters developed more naturalistic proportions. Her grin is enormous and slightly off. Her limbs are liquid. She sings her introduction song, Other Friends, in a voice that is too cheerful and too fast, operating somewhere adjacent to the enjoyment of other beings suffering. She's a villain introduction. She's also, fairly quickly, something else entirely. Spinel was Pink Diamond's playmate. Pink Diamond, before she was given Earth as a colony, was essentially a child by Diamond standards. Impulsive, playful, not yet assigned to a serious function. Spinel was created to keep her company. They played together in a garden on Homeworld. It was apparently Pink Diamond's happiest time. And then Pink Diamond was assigned to Earth, and she left. She told Spinel to wait for her in the garden. She told her, it was a game. Stay perfectly still and wait for me to come back. Spinel, who loved Pink Diamond with an uncomplicated and complete devotion, stayed. She stood perfectly still in the garden for 6,000 years, waiting. She only learned the truth when Steven's broadcast reached her. The cheerful announcement from Pink Diamond's son, telling the universe that everything was peaceful now. Spinel learned, in one moment, that she'd been abandoned, that the game had never been a game, that the person she'd waited for wasn't coming back, had never been coming back, and hadn't cared enough to come back and tell her that. What 6,000 years of held grief, released all at once, looks like. Apparently a rubber hose cartoon character with a scythe arriving to destroy the Earth. Her weapon is a rejuvenator, a device that resets a gem to their factory default, erasing their personality and memories. She uses it on Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl. She wants to undo them. She wants to undo the people who were closest to Pink Diamond, who got what she didn't. Proximity, purpose, a relationship that lasted. The way Steven reaches her isn't by defeating her militarily or out-arguing her. It's by listening. By being willing to sit in the wreckage of what she's caused and acknowledge that what was done to her was real. By saying, without defending his mother or calculating strategically, this happened to you, and it was wrong, and I'm sorry. Her character design being the way it is, that old-fashioned, almost slapstick style, is a choice that I think is smarter than it initially appears. She's been frozen in time. Literally. She stood still for 6,000 years. She looks like something from a period before modern animation, because she is, in a sense, a relic. She's the person Pink Diamond left behind when she moved forward, preserved in the aesthetic of the time she was abandoned. She hasn't changed because she was never given the chance to change. What she gets at the end of the film is the diamonds. They take her in because she reminds them of Pink, of the Pink Diamond who played in gardens before she was given responsibilities she couldn't bear. It's bittersweet in the way that things are bittersweet when the resolution involves being loved, partly because of who you remind someone of, rather than entirely for who you are. But it's something. A place to land. A chance to start again. Rebecca Sugar has spoken about Spinel as representing the grief of abandonment, specifically. The grief that isn't just about losing someone, but about discovering that you were not considered enough to be told. Not told when something changed. Not told when the relationship was over. Left in a game that only you were still playing, while the other person had moved on to something they found more interesting. There's also something the film is doing with Steven that's worth noting. He begins it having saved the world, expecting a peace that doesn't quite arrive. The disruption isn't only Spinel. It's the discovery that happily ever after is a genre convention, not an actual condition. There are still consequences from before the peace. There are still people who were hurt before the peace arrived and haven't had anywhere to put that hurt. The show has a lot of characters who are shaped by what they couldn't let go of. Spinel is the most extreme version of this, the person who couldn't let go because she was told the letting go wasn't her choice to make. Waiting wasn't her preference. It was a game that someone else invented. And she played it faithfully, past all reason, past all evidence that the other player was never coming back. There's something about Spinel's arc that I keep coming back to. Maybe because the waiting is such a specific and recognizable thing, even if the scale of it isn't. The way you can hold something in place inside yourself, long after the thing it was held for has moved on. And the particular quality of the grief when you finally discover it was never going to come back at all. 2 years after the events of Change Your Mind, Steven Universe is, by any visible measure, doing well. He's 17. He's living in a new house he had built next to the Crystal Temple. The diamonds have come to Earth and helped restore many of the corrupted gems. Little Homeschool is up and running, a program Steven built to help homeworld gems learn how to exist on Earth, to choose their own paths, to build lives that don't follow homeworld's categories. His friends are thriving. The war is over. He did what he came here to do. And he is not okay. Steven Universe Future is a 20-episode epilogue series that ran from late 2019 to early 2020. And it's the part of the franchise I think about most when I think about what the show ultimately accomplished. Because it's doing something that most stories don't do. Most stories end at the victory. This one starts there. The first thing the series establishes is that Steven is still running on the same nervous system he had when the stakes were existential. The war is over. The threat is gone. His body and mind don't know that. He's still vigilant, still alert, still ready for the next crisis. The next crisis, for a while, keeps arriving. Homeworld gems with problems, old enemies who need to be processed, new situations that require his specific skills. He handles them. He smiles. He says he's fine. His powers start behaving differently. There's a pink state, a physical manifestation that appears when Steven is overwhelmed or threatened, where his eyes go pink and his abilities become more aggressive rather than more protective. The first time it happens, it's startling. The show frames it carefully without sensationalizing it. This is a stress response. This is what it looks like when a body has been in high alert mode for years and is starting to run on fumes. The accumulation of the series is watching Steven fail to acknowledge this. He takes on more. He helps more people. He solves more problems. He is, in the language of the previous seasons, a healer. Someone whose fundamental power is making things better for others. He applies this role to every situation around him while not applying it to the situation directly in front of him, which is himself. The little homeschool arc is worth examining on its own. Stephen built the school to help former homeworld gems integrate into Earth life. It's a generous and compassionate project, and it works. But Stephen's role in it is to be the helper, the facilitator, the one who makes the connection possible. He's not a student. He's running the place. And when the gems he's helped start to grow past their need for little homeschool, when they get jobs and form relationships and make lives that don't revolve around the school, Stephen experiences something the show identifies carefully as a particular kind of grief. He built this to help people, and the evidence of his success is that they don't need him anymore. He doesn't know what to do with that. That's a very specific thing to put in a children's show. The grief of the helper when their help is no longer needed. The sense that your value is contingent on being necessary. The anxiety that if you stop being useful, there's nothing underneath. Jasper returns in future, having been corrupted and then healed by the diamonds, and she's in a state of profound disorientation. The creature she was, entirely defined by her function as a soldier, built for a war that no longer exists, is in conflict with the situation she's in, which has no war, no enemy, no place for what she is. She keeps coming after Stephen, picking fights. She tells him she wants to fight someone strong. Stephen keeps trying to give her something else, some alternative to the fight she's looking for. Their arc in future is the show being honest about the limits of Stephen's particular approach. He can offer people alternatives. He can show them other ways. He can be endlessly patient. But he can't want something for someone more than they want it for themselves. There's an episode called Everything's Fine, which is one of the most uncomfortable episodes in the series. The discomfort is entirely generated by the gap between what Stephen is saying and what is visibly happening. He says everything's fine approximately 30 times across the episode. He means it, or he means to mean it. Garnet, Pearl, Amethyst, and Greg can all see that he isn't fine. None of them quite know how to reach him. The episode ends without resolution. What eventually happens is a breakdown. It comes in I Am My Monster, the penultimate episode, and it involves Stephen's pink state taking over completely, his body transforming into something enormous and wrong-footed, a physical manifestation of everything he hasn't looked at. His family, his friends, everyone he loves, showing up not to fight him but to tell him they love him, to be present in it with him. The episode is called I Am My Monster. That's the acknowledgement at the center of it. I'm not fine. The thing you've been seeing is actually me. The resolution is Stephen agreeing to get help. Not, I am okay now. Not, I've learned my lesson. Just, I'm going to see a therapist. I'm going to stop pretending. I'm going to leave Beach City for a while and figure out who I am when I'm not solving everyone else's problems. The finale is a road trip. Stephen in Greg's van, driving into a future that doesn't have a map. All of his people gathered to say goodbye. The show doesn't tell you what happens next. It ends with the possibility of rest. Rebecca Sugar talked about future as being shaped by her own experience coming out of the show's production. The burnout, the years of sustained emotional output, the discovery that making something meaningful doesn't exempt you from needing to be taken care of. She said in several interviews that the healing she wrote into the show was also the healing she was looking for at the time, and that finding it was slower and harder than it looked in Stephen's version of events. There's also a thread in future around forgiveness that the series is honest about. Stephen has forgiven a lot of people across the main series. The diamonds, gems, who did harm, gems who hurt him personally. He's the show's forgiveness engine. And Future asks at various points whether all of that forgiveness has been fully processed or whether some of it has been performed, whether Stephen has actually felt the hurt of what was done to him, or whether he's been redirecting it into helpfulness. The pink state is partly an answer to that question. All the hurt is there. It's just been in the wrong place. What Future does that I think is genuinely important enough that I come back to it as a reason the franchise deserves to be taken seriously, is refuse the easy version of the ending. The easy version is the hero saves the world and then everything is good. The honest version is the hero saves the world and then has to figure out how to live in the aftermath of having been a hero for their entire childhood. Those are different tasks. The second one doesn't have a villain. It doesn't have a clear objective. It's just the quiet, difficult work of being a person. There aren't many stories that go there. Fewer still that go there well. Steven Universe Future goes there well. Greg Universe drives a van. He runs a car wash called It's Awash, which is a pun he apparently finds satisfying because he's never going to change the name. He lives, at least in the earlier seasons, largely in the van, which is also where he keeps his guitar and his cassette collection and his preferred denim vest. He was once, briefly, a moderately successful musician with a single called Let Me Drive My Van Into Your Heart, which Steven knows all the words to, and which is, if you listen to it, actually quite good. He is not an extraordinary person. This is the point. Steven Universe is a show full of beings with cosmic scale, ancient histories, powers that can reshape planets. Greg is the one human who's been inside that world from the beginning, who loved the most complicated and significant being in it, who has continued to live a normal human life alongside it without being consumed by the scale. He is deliberately ordinary, and the show treats his ordinariness as a form of wisdom rather than a limitation. The episodes told from Greg's perspective, or that focus on his relationship with Steven, tend to be among the show's most emotionally straightforward, not simple. Greg has his own complexity, his own choices he's made and things he's let go, but without the Baroque weight of gem history that most of the show carries. When Steven needs to be with someone who will just be present with him, he goes to Greg. Story for Steven tells the story of how Greg met Rose through flashback. He was young, performing to a crowd of 2, and Rose happened to be in the audience. The story of their courtship is sweet and slightly absurd. He chases her van in his van across a parking lot, and it works somehow. But the episode also establishes what it was like to love someone like Rose. Enormous, ancient, curious about everything, capable of deep care and genuinely difficult to fully reach. We Need to Talk is the more complicated episode. It comes later and deals with the moment Greg asked Rose directly whether she actually saw him as a real person, or whether humans were simply interesting things to her, fascinating and temporary, and not quite the same as gems. It's a brave question for a 22-year-old to ask someone who has been alive for thousands of years. Rose's response is earnest and honest about the limits of her capacity to fully understand what Greg is asking. She tries. The trying is real. The gap remains. The show doesn't resolve this. Greg and Rose loved each other. Rose also found humans difficult to fully understand in the way that someone who doesn't share your mortality and your contingency might find it difficult to fully grasp what your life actually is. Greg understood this. He stayed anyway. His parenting of Steven is what the show returns to, and what it shows is a man who doesn't have answers but never pretends to. When Steven comes to him with enormous questions about his mother, about his identity, about what he's supposed to do with everything he's inherited, Greg says, often. Some version of, I don't know, bud, and then stays. He brings donuts. He plays guitar. He doesn't go anywhere. That might sound like a small thing. In context, it isn't. Steven spends most of the series surrounded by people who have answers, who have agendas, who need things from him or have things to hide about him. Greg is the person who is simply there without an agenda, without a secret, without needing Steven to be anything other than what he is. That's rare in Steven's world. His relationship with the crystal gems is drawn in careful strokes. He and Pearl have a complicated dynamic for much of the series. Pearl loved Rose in a way that Greg's presence represents a loss she can never quite forgive. And the show is honest about this discomfort without making Pearl a villain for feeling it. Their relationship gets a real moment in Mr. Greg, a musical episode midway through the series, where they end up processing their mutual grief about Rose together at a fancy hotel. Improbably, but correctly. The episode ends with them having something like a truce, something like a genuine understanding, not a resolution, a truce. With Amethyst, Greg has a warmth that the show builds slowly. Maximum Capacity, the episode where they watch terrible television together as a grief coping mechanism, is uncomfortable and true. Two people using proximity and distraction to avoid harder conversations. But there's also a real fondness in it, and the show allows them eventually to be honest with each other about what they were doing. Mr. Universe, the song Greg sings in the film, is his thesis statement. It's a song about being a person who had dreams and chose instead a life made of love and proximity and the ordinary pleasures of knowing specific people well. He's not a hero. He's not extraordinary. He's Steven's dad, and he chose to be. And the choice was right, and he knows it. There's a piece in that song that isn't resignation. It's something more like contentment. In Steven Universe Future, when Steven is visibly falling apart and everyone around him is uncertain how to reach him, Greg is one of the first people to see it. He tries. He doesn't immediately succeed because nobody does. But he shows up. He keeps showing up. What Greg offers the show, ultimately, is a human scale within an inhuman scope. He's the person who reminds you every time he appears that what all of this enormous gem mythology is ultimately about is the specific lives of specific people. Not empires, not wars, specific love. Small, consistent, undramatic, irreplaceable, the kind that doesn't require a gemstone to generate or a cosmic scale to justify. The kind that shows up with donuts and stays. That's the argument the show makes through Greg, quietly and consistently, across 7 years of episodes. That presence is a form of heroism. That loving someone steadily, without needing to be the most important thing to them, without needing to understand every part of their experience, is worth doing. That the person who does that, who just keeps being there, is not ordinary in any way that counts. We always come back to the beach, somehow. It's one of the things I've noticed about Steven Universe on rewatches. However large the story gets, however deep into homeworld politics, or ancient gem history, or the interior of characters' grief, the show finds its way back to Beach City, to the boardwalk, to the sound of the ocean. I find that reassuring. Not in a lazy way. In the way that a very good story reassures you. By showing you, over and over, that the world is still there. Unchanged in the ways that matter. Holding the characters you've come to know. What we've been sitting with tonight is a show that asks an unusual amount of its audience. It asks you to hold complexity. To stay with characters who don't resolve neatly. Whose arcs take years rather than episodes. Whose growth is partial and real and sometimes not visible in any given scene. It asks you to let a story about alien gemstones make you think about how you love people. How you understand your own history. How you carry the things that happened before you had words for them. Pearl learning that love can exist without self-erasure. Amethyst learning that she isn't a mistake. Ruby and Sapphire choosing each other over and over as a continuous decision rather than a permanent state. Lapis doing what she can with what she has left, on her own terms and timeline. Peridot, finding that uncertainty is survivable. Bismuth carrying righteous anger and a difficult truth about what righteous anger can lead to. Spinel standing in a garden for 6,000 years, and then finally being found. Steven learning that he is not his mother, and that this is not a betrayal of her, but a fact about himself. And Greg, always Greg, just there, with the van and the guitar and the donuts, present in all the ways that matter most. These are not small things to have worked through in a children's cartoon across 11-minute episodes over 7 years. And the fact that the show managed to do it while also containing a running joke about a conspiracy blog and a recurring character who is simply unsettling and unexplained. That it held the cosmic and the silly at the same register is its own kind of achievement. Rebecca Sugar, after the show ended, took several years away. She's spoken about the burnout honestly, about the way that making something for other people at sustained intensity can leave you uncertain who you are when it's over. The album she eventually made, Spiral Bound, is quiet and personal and about the slow process of finding out. She sings on it, "I'm taking my sweet time," which sounds, if you know the show, like something Steven might have sung to himself in the van on the way to somewhere new. What the show ultimately argues, I think, and it argues it in many different ways across many different characters and arcs, is that you don't have to be fixed to be loved. That growth is real even when it's slow. That the person you're becoming doesn't have to look like the person you were supposed to be. That the gem you were extracted to be isn't necessarily the gem you are. Those are the things that stick with me, at least. The specific ways the show is patient with people who are still figuring it out. The way it refuses to hurry anyone's healing or demand that they resolve more cleanly than they're able to. The way it keeps returning to the beach, where the ocean is always present and the light is always late afternoon and the town is always slightly run down in the specific way of a place that is genuinely loved. If you've never watched Steven Universe and tonight has made you want to, it starts with a boy who can't summon his weapon, and a cookie cat ice cream sandwich he's very happy to have located, and a centipedal monster in the Crystal Temple. It gets more complicated. It gets better as it gets more complicated. If you've seen it before and tonight has been a way of spending time in a world you already know, I hope it was comfortable. The crystal gems are where you left them. The music is what you remember. The beach is there. Whatever you were thinking about before you put this on, I hope it's a bit quieter now. Good night.